The phone rang at exactly midnight. Not my cell, that was charging on my nightstand, but the landline in my home office that almost nobody had the number for. I glanced away from the skyscraper blueprints spread across my desk, the green light of my architect's lamp casting eerie shadows across the sustainable design I'd been perfecting for weeks. Hello? My voice sounded hollow in the empty office. Check your garage, Mr. Voss. The voice was digitally altered, a mechanical monotone that sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, the line went dead. Under normal circumstances, I would have dismissed it as a prank call. But something in that artificial voice carried weight, like the caller knew something I didn't. I set down my pencil and made my way to the garage, flipping lights on as I moved through my silent house. When I opened the door to the garage, my breath caught in my throat. The space where my 1967 Shelby GT500 should have been gaped back at me, an accusatory void. My prized possession, the classic muscle car I'd spent 3 years restoring with my own hands, was gone. No broken glass, no sign of forced entry, just absence where beauty should have been. I called the police immediately, but I could tell from the officer's tone that my stolen car was just another report to file. These things happen, Mr. Voss. We'll keep an eye out, but don't get your hopes up. I was still pacing the empty garage when I heard the front door open and close, followed by the distinct sound of Vanessa's heels on the marble floor. My wife was home from her corporate event, the third this week. Dom. You won't believe the connections I made tonight. Her voice carried through the house, bubbly with excitement and something else I couldn't quite place. When she appeared at the garage door, her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes shone with unnatural brightness. Why are you standing in the garage in the middle of the night? The Shelby's gone. Stolen. I watched her face carefully, searching for genuine shock or concern. Oh. She blinked twice. Did you call the police? Of course I called the police. I moved past her into the house, noticing for the first time the diamond bracelet glinting on her wrist. That's new. Her hand instinctively moved to cover it, then stopped halfway through the gesture. Just a little something I picked up. End of quarter bonus came through. I nodded, not trusting myself to respond without revealing my suspicions. I'm going to make some coffee. It's going to be a long night. While Vanessa went upstairs to change, I noticed her purse on the kitchen counter. I'd never been the type to snoop, but something about tonight felt wrong on every level. With a silent apology to my former self, the trusting husband I used to be, I opened her bag. Inside, beneath her wallet and makeup, I found a receipt from the Cambridge Regency Hotel, a business expense for lunch dated yesterday. And tucked beside it, a business card, Blake Reynolds, CFO, Corwin Capital. Blake Reynolds. The name hit me like a physical blow. The same Blake Reynolds who had pulled out of my biggest project a year ago, nearly destroying my reputation in the process. The investor whose withdrawal had caused a cascade of financial problems that I was only now beginning to overcome. Why would my wife have his card? And why would she hide having lunch with him? I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it and closed the bag just as Vanessa's footsteps sounded on the stairs. I poured 2 cups of coffee, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. You should come to bed, she said, taking the coffee with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There's nothing you can do about the car tonight. I need to finish those blueprints, I said, watching her over the rim of my mug. The Morrison project is due next week. She shrugged, kissed my cheek and headed back upstairs. I returned to my office, but the blueprints no longer held my attention. My mind was filled with questions and a growing sense of betrayal. A week after my car disappeared, my friend Michael showed me photos from a charity gala held at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Thought you'd want to see these, he said, his expression grim as he handed me his phone. The images showed Vanessa in an emerald dress I'd never seen before, leaning close to a tall man with silver-streaked hair. They were speaking intimately, his hand resting on the small of her back. Blake Reynolds. I handed the phone back without comment. Michael watched me carefully. You knew. I suspected, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Thanks for confirming it. That evening, Garrett, my business partner, called with unexpected news. Berlin wants us. 6-month project, full creative control, massive sustainability initiative. This could put us back on the map, Dom. When would we start? I asked, watching through the window as Vanessa pulled into the driveway in her BMW. 2 weeks. It's a quick turnaround, but they specifically requested you. I thought about the empty space in my garage, the receipt from Cambridge Regency, and the way Vanessa hadn't asked about the car investigation once since that night. I'm in, I said. Send me the details. Before I left for Berlin, I had work to do. Hidden cameras, tracking devices on Vanessa's vehicles, and a quiet consultation with a private security firm. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. First, I needed to understand exactly what game was being played. And then I would learn how to win it. 3 weeks into my Berlin assignment, I sat alone in my rented apartment, staring at my laptop screen. The data from the tracking devices I'd placed on Vanessa's cars painted a disturbing picture. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, her BMW showed up at an address in Cambridge. Like clockwork. I took a sip of cold coffee and pulled up the contact information I'd been avoiding using until now. Leo Blackwood, former military intelligence officer, now a private investigator with a reputation for discretion and thoroughness. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Voss," he said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. "I was wondering when you'd call. You know who I am? I make it my business to know potential clients. What can I do for you?" I explained the situation, the stolen Shelby, Vanessa's suspicious behavior, the Cambridge address, while leaving out my growing suspicions about my parents' involvement. Some things were too painful to articulate until I had proof. "I'll look into it," Leo said. "But just so we're clear, you want the whole truth no matter where it leads?" "The whole truth," I confirmed, ignoring the knot forming in my stomach. 2 days later, Leo's email arrived with the subject line, "Initial findings." The Cambridge property belonged to Blake Reynolds. No surprise there. What did surprise me was the attached file documenting Blake's connections to my family, connections that predated my birth. But the real shock came later that week. Leo sent me footage from one of the hidden cameras I'd installed at home. The timestamp showed 3 a.m., 5 days after I'd left for Berlin. My parents, Theodore and Patricia Voss, were helping load my Shelby onto a flatbed truck. My own parents stealing my car. I watched the footage 7 times, searching for some alternative explanation, finding none. I called Leo immediately. "I need more," I said when he answered. "This can't be what it looks like." "I'll dig deeper," he promised. "But prepare yourself, family betrayals usually have deep roots." He wasn't wrong. The next day, Leo forwarded scanned newspaper articles from 40 years ago. My father and Blake's father had been business partners in a promising architectural firm. According to court documents, Blake's father had fraudulently forced my father out, causing my family's financial ruin. Memories flooded back, the constant penny pinching during my childhood, my father's bitter comments about practical careers, whenever I mentioned my dream of becoming an architect, my mother's obsession with social climbing. I'd always attributed their behavior to typical parental concern, but now I saw it differently, as the aftermath of trauma they'd never recovered from. The financial trail Leo uncovered was equally revealing. My Shelby had been sold at a private auction for $285,000. $215,000 had been transferred to Blake Reynolds as an investment opportunity. The remaining $70,000 had paid off my parents' mortgage. That night, unable to sleep, I checked Vanessa's Instagram page. Something I'd stopped doing months ago when her posts had become increasingly disconnected from our real life together. Her latest photo showed her hand sporting an ostentatious diamond ring I'd never seen before, with the caption, "New beginnings with B. Some secrets are worth keeping." The comment section was filled with congratulations, including one from my mother. When Leo called the next morning, the exhaustion in his voice told me he'd been working through the night. "Your wife had a previous marriage," he said without preamble. "Ended 8 years ago before you met her. Husband died under questionable circumstances. Carbon monoxide leak while she was conveniently out of town. She collected a $1 million insurance payout. And no one investigated?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "Someone tried. A detective working for the insurance company started asking questions, then suddenly stopped. A month later he bought a boat and moved to Florida." I sat in silence, processing this information. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd shared my life with for 5 years, was a stranger to me. Perhaps she always had been. "What do you want to do next?" Leo asked after giving me a moment. "Keep digging," I said. "I need to understand the full picture before I make any moves. And Leo, I want surveillance on my parents too. If they're willing to steal from me, who knows what else they might do." That afternoon, I threw myself into the Berlin project with renewed intensity. My colleagues noticed the change, attributing my focus to professional passion rather than personal crisis. If they only knew that the complex sustainability solutions I was developing served a dual purpose. They weren't just securing my professional future, they were providing the perfect cover for planning something much more intricate. Because I was beginning to see the outlines of a different kind of architecture, the architecture of revenge. A structure built not with steel and glass, but with evidence, legal maneuvers and psychological leverage. A design that would force everyone involved to face the consequences of their betrayal. I opened my notebook and began to sketch, not a building this time but a plan. Phase 1, gather evidence. Phase 2, position assets. Phase 3, spring the trap. It was time to show them what happens when you betray an architect. The Berlin therapist's office was nothing like I'd expected. No leather couch, no dimly lit room with Freudian undertones. Instead, Dr. Elizabeth Meyer's space was bright, minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Spree River. Like me, she believed environments shape our psychology. "So, Mr. Voss," she said, her English carrying just a hint of German precision, "you've experienced a significant betrayal. Multiple betrayals, in fact." I'd spent the last hour detailing everything. The stolen Shelby, Vanessa's affair, my parents' involvement, the generations-old family feud I'd never known about. Dr. Meyer had listened without judgment, taking occasional notes in a small leather-bound journal. "What do you want from this situation?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Revenge? Justice? Closure? These are different destinations requiring different maps." Her question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on uncovering the truth that I hadn't fully articulated what came next. I paused, searching for the right words. "I want them to understand what they've done. Not just legally but emotionally. I want redemption, but I don't want to become like them in the process." She nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Then we need a three-phase approach. Evidence gathering, legal positioning, and psychological restitution. You're an architect. You understand that proper foundations are essential for lasting structures." Over the next 6 weeks, I divided my time between the Berlin project and my personal reconstruction. The sustainability complex I was designing garnered attention from international green building councils, leading to 3 additional contracts. My professional resurrection was proceeding precisely as planned. Meanwhile, Leo continued his investigation, sending me daily updates that I reviewed each night after leaving the office. The picture they painted grew increasingly complex and disturbing. "Your wife and Reynolds had multiple phone conversations that we were able to record," Leo explained during one of our secure calls. "In one of them, she specifically says, 'Dominic needs to pay for his father's sins.' Does that mean anything to you?" I thought back to the newspaper articles about my father and Blake's father. Maybe. What else did they say? "Reynolds mentioned something about your father refusing to testify in a fraud case decades ago. Said his father went to prison because Theodore Voss conveniently lost his memory when it counted." Family secrets. Always deeper than they appeared on the surface. I consulted with a German attorney specializing in international intellectual property law, carefully freezing joint accounts and creating complex financial structures that would protect my assets once I made my move. I wasn't just gathering ammunition, I was building a fortress. On a rainy Tuesday in my 3rd month in Berlin, I received a call from Sonia Rodriguez, a ruthless divorce attorney known for handling cases of spousal betrayal. "Mr. Voss," she said after I'd briefed her, "this isn't just about divorce. Your wife and this Reynolds character have engaged in financial conspiracy against you. And there's something else you should know." I braced myself for another revelation. "Reynolds has been buying up your parents' debts through shell companies. Based on the evidence your investigator provided, he's created a financial trap that gives him leverage over them. This wasn't just opportunity, it was methodical. That night, I used a series of anonymous transactions to purchase a remote luxury property, Black Pine Lodge in the mountains of New Hampshire, through shell companies that couldn't be traced back to me. It would serve as the perfect setting for the final phase of my plan. I asked Dr. Meyer to help design what she called a therapeutic environment, a space engineered to facilitate truth-telling and emotional reckoning. She was hesitant at first, until I showed her the evidence Leo had collected. "This is not conventional therapy," she warned, but her eyes sparkled with professional curiosity. "But then again, this is not a conventional situation." Together, we designed a program, voluntary but structured, with clear psychological objectives and impeccable legal protections. Every detail was considered, from the room layouts to the daily schedules to the carefully scripted interactions. Just as I was finalizing the plans, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in months, my father's. "Son," Theodore's voice sounded older, weaker than I remembered. "Blake Reynolds is blackmailing us. There are things you don't know, things that started before you were even born." "I know more than you think, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice even despite the anger and hurt simmering beneath the surface. No, you don't, he insisted. This isn't just about the business deal gone wrong. It's about what happened after. Why your mother and I. His voice broke. We need to talk in person. Please. After hanging up, I stared out at the Berlin skyline, watching as lights flickered on across the city. Every building I could see represented someone's vision made real, someone's plan executed with precision. My own plan was nearing completion, the foundation laid, the structure sound, every element in place. But my father's call had introduced a new variable, a potential weakness in the design that needed addressing. I opened my laptop and booked a flight to Boston. It was time to confront the shadows of the past face to face, before executing the architecture of my revenge. I returned to Boston under the cover of darkness, slipping into the city like a ghost. Instead of going to my own home, now just a property on paper, no longer a sanctuary, I checked into a newly purchased apartment in the Seaport District, leased under one of my shell companies. The doorman didn't recognize me, which was precisely the point. From the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the harbor lights dancing on the black water. Boston had always been beautiful at night, when its rough edges softened and its colonial bones gave way to modern illumination. Once I had felt I belonged here. Now I was a stranger in my own city. I met my father the next morning in the Boston Public Garden. He'd suggested a coffee shop, but I wanted open space, somewhere we couldn't be easily overheard. Theodore Voss looked a decade older than when I'd last seen him just months ago. His shoulders stooped beneath his worn wool coat, and his eyes darted nervously around the park. You look well, he said as we walked along the path, frost crunching beneath our feet. Berlin must agree with you. Cut the small talk, Dad, I replied. You stole my car. You and Mom helped Vanessa betray me. I want to know why. He flinched as though I'd struck him. It's complicated, Dominic. Then uncomplicated. We sat on a bench overlooking the pond, empty now that winter had stripped away autumn's charm. My father stared at his hands, liver-spotted and trembling slightly, before finally speaking. I had evidence against Blake's father, he whispered. Documents that would have sent him to prison for decades. But your mother was pregnant with you and we were desperate. He offered financial help in exchange for those documents. So you took a bribe, I said flatly. I did worse, he replied, his voice barely audible. I altered other documents before they went to the prosecution. Charles Reynolds went to prison for 3 years instead of 30. When he got out, he destroyed what was left of my reputation in the industry. The pieces were fitting together now, forming a mosaic of generational betrayal. Your mother never knew the full truth, he continued. She believes Vanessa is saving you from a fate like mine. Patricia thinks she's protecting you by pushing you toward what she sees as practical success. By stealing my car? By helping my wife betray me? We're not proud of what we've done, he said, a tear slipping down his weathered cheek. But fear makes people do terrible things, son. Fear and shame. I left him on that bench, his confession hanging in the cold air between us. My next meeting would require a different approach. Melissa Harper had been Blake Reynolds' executive assistant for 7 years before abruptly leaving Corwin Capital 6 months ago. Finding her hadn't been difficult. Leo had tracked her to a small accounting firm in Somerville. Convincing her to meet me had been surprisingly easy. Mr. Reynolds has a pattern, she told me over lunch at a quiet restaurant near her office. He systematically targets the wives or girlfriends of men he considers threats or competitors. Sometimes for information, sometimes for revenge, sometimes just because he can. Her eyes didn't meet mine as she spoke, her finger tracing the rim of her water glass. You were one of them, I guessed. She nodded. My husband worked for a rival investment firm. Blake told me it was love. When I finally realized what was happening and tried to end it, he threatened to destroy my husband's career. I left my job instead. And your husband? Never knew. We divorced last year anyway. Her smile was bitter. Turns out secrets poison relationships even when they stay secret. That evening, Leo sent me video evidence from an auto shop in New Hampshire. The footage showed Blake paying an expert to tamper with my Shelby's frame, deliberately reducing its value. It gets worse, Leo said when I called him. I found testimony from Vanessa's first marriage. Her husband died when carbon monoxide filled their garage while he slept in the car. The official ruling was suicide, but his family fought the insurance payout, claiming he had no history of depression. Let me guess, the investigation mysteriously stalled. Exactly. $1 million payout, case closed. The next day, I arranged a confidential meeting with the board of directors of Corwin Capital, minus Blake. I presented evidence of his questionable business practices, including manipulation of company funds to finance his personal vendettas. I didn't ask them to fire him, that would have been too obvious. Instead, I simply suggested they might want to conduct an internal audit before the SEC got involved. Their expressions told me everything I needed to know. Blake's days at Corwin were numbered. The final piece of evidence came from the Cambridge Regency Hotel. My hidden cameras captured a heated argument between Vanessa and Blake in the hotel bar. She was demanding he accelerate the plan against Voss, while he insisted they needed to be patient. "You promised me a fresh start," she hissed, the diamond ring on her finger catching the light as she jabbed her finger into his chest. "I've done everything you asked. I want what you promised." The next morning, I filed for divorce and simultaneously launched a corporate espionage lawsuit against Blake Reynolds and Corwin Capital. The first shots in my campaign had been fired, but the real battle, the one that would bring true restitution, was just beginning. As I watched the legal machinery begin to turn, I finalized the preparations at Black Pine Lodge. The invitations to my carefully orchestrated redemption program would be delivered soon. Not everyone would accept, of course, but they would all pay attention. That much I could guarantee. Vanessa received the divorce papers at precisely 1:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. I had timed it perfectly. She was hosting a lunch for potential clients at Sorellina, one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants. Leo's associate delivered the thick envelope with professional courtesy, placing it beside her plate of barely touched risotto. From across the street, in a cafe with a perfect view of the restaurant's front windows, I watched through binoculars as she excused herself from the table. Even from this distance, I could see the color drain from her face as she read the documents. She fumbled for her phone, no doubt calling Blake, only to be directed straight to voicemail. His phone, at that very moment, was being confiscated as part of Corwin Capital's surprise internal audit. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I made my first public appearance since returning to Boston. I'd chosen my armor carefully, a charcoal Brioni suit tailored to perfection, hair freshly cut in a style sharper and more severe than my previous look, and a cold confidence I'd rehearsed with Dr. Meyer via secure video calls. I walked into the Boston Architectural Center's annual sustainability conference as though I owned the building. Conversations stuttered to a halt as I passed. Former colleagues stared, then quickly averted their eyes when I met their gaze. I spotted Garrett, my ex-business partner, turning pale as I approached the speaker's podium to deliver my previously unannounced keynote address. "Sustainable architecture isn't just about buildings," I began, my voice carrying through the stunned audience. "It's about creating structures that can withstand betrayal, erosion of trust, and attacks from unexpected directions. It's about building something that lasts despite adverse conditions." By that afternoon, news of my return had spread through Boston's architectural community like wildfire. By evening, I had secured 2 major contracts that had previously been slated for my former firm. Clients who had heard about my Berlin success and were eager to align themselves with what they perceived as the winning side. Vanessa tried to access our joint accounts that same day, only to find them frozen pending the divorce proceedings. Sonia Rodriguez, my divorce attorney, had filed for an emergency asset freeze based on evidence of financial fraud, specifically the transfer of funds from the sale of my Shelby. "Your wife is furious," Sonia reported during our evening call, amusement evident in her voice. "She's already on her 3rd attorney. The first 2 quit when I showed them what we have." Meanwhile, Blake Reynolds was facing his own nightmare. An anonymous whistleblower, not me though I certainly could have been, had sent the SEC detailed evidence of financial improprieties at Corwin Capital, with Blake at the center. The board had placed him on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. I received a call from my mother that night, the first time she'd attempted to contact me since I'd left for Berlin. "Dominic, you don't understand what you're doing," Patricia's voice wavered between anger and desperation. "We did what we had to do. It was for your own good." "Was it for my own good when you helped steal my car?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Or when you encouraged my wife's affair with a man whose family destroyed ours?" "Things aren't that simple," she insisted. "You need to stop this vendetta before people get hurt." "People have already been hurt, Mother. I'm simply ensuring the right people face consequences." I hung up before she could respond, turning my attention to the preliminary hearing for the recovery of my Shelby. By extraordinary coincidence, or perhaps because I had donated my services to design her eco-friendly home renovation the previous year, Judge Crawford had been assigned to the case. The transport company that had moved my car provided recorded conversations in which Blake specifically requested accidental damage to occur during transit, for an additional fee of course. The evidence was damning, the ruling swift. Within 24 hours of the hearing, a freezing order was placed on the assets of Vanessa, Blake, and my parents pending further investigation into what was now being treated as a conspiracy case. That evening I received a text from Leo. Theodore has left the family home. Rented a room at the extended stay in Framingham. Patricia tried to stop him, but he packed a suitcase and walked out. The first cracks were appearing in their alliance. It was time for the next phase. I sent identical cream-colored envelopes to all 4 conspirators, Vanessa, Blake, Theodore, and Patricia. Each contained the same message, printed on heavy cardstock in elegant letterpress. An invitation to restitution. Tomorrow, 7 p.m., Voss Tower. The top-floor conference room of my newly renamed company headquarters would provide the perfect setting for what came next. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city they had tried to take from me, a panoramic view of the world I was reclaiming piece by methodical piece. As I placed the final touches on my presentation, the evidence, the bank statements, the legal documents that would shape our collective future, I felt a strange calm. This wasn't just revenge. It was architecture of the highest order, creating a structure that would force accountability while offering a path to redemption. Not everyone would take that path, of course, but by tomorrow night, they would all understand exactly what options remained to them. And not one of those options included escaping the consequences of what they had done. The top floor of Voss Tower gleamed in the evening light, the conference room a testament to my design philosophy, sustainable luxury that made no apologies for its ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Boston's skyline, the city lights beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky. I arrived 2 hours early to prepare, setting out 4 folders at precise intervals around the polished walnut table. Each contained identical evidence but personalized consequences, tailored suits of accountability, measured to fit their specific transgressions. Vanessa arrived first, exactly at 7, wearing a black designer dress that I recognized as new. Her diamond engagement ring from Blake caught the light as she clutched her handbag, a defensive posture I'd never seen from her before. "What is this about, Dom?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her shoulders. "Please take a seat," I replied, gesturing to the chair with her name on it. "We'll begin when everyone arrives." Blake came next, his usual confidence diminished by the week's events. His eyes darted from me to Vanessa, clearly trying to gauge whether we'd been comparing notes. The perfect Windsor knot of his tie couldn't hide the strain in his neck as he nodded stiffly in my direction. My father entered looking haggard, the weight of his actions visible in the new lines etched on his face. He attempted to make eye contact with me, but I deliberately turned away, directing my attention to my mother as she stepped out of the elevator. Patricia Voss entered as if attending a society function rather than a reckoning. Hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless, spine rigid with practiced dignity. The facade cracked only when she saw Theodore already seated, separated from the chair reserved for her. "Why is everyone here together?" she demanded, looking from face to face. "Dominic, what are you playing at?" "This isn't a game, Mother," I replied, touching a control panel that dimmed the lights and activated the projection system. "This is a presentation about consequences and opportunities." For the next 45 minutes, I methodically laid out the evidence. The conspiracy to steal and damage my car, the financial trails leading from the sale to Blake's accounts and my parents' mortgage, the recordings of Vanessa and Blake plotting against me, the documented history of Blake's father and mine. "And here," I said, bringing up a new slide, "is where things get particularly interesting." Vanessa's previous marriage ended with the death of Thomas Bennett in what was ruled a suicide. The insurance company initially disputed the $1 million payout, until their investigator mysteriously dropped the case. Vanessa's face remained impassive, but her knuckles whitened around the armrests of her chair. That same investigator purchased a boat worth exactly $45,000 1 month later, I continued. Coincidentally, that sum was withdrawn from Vanessa's account in 3 separate transactions of $15,000 each. Blake shifted in his chair, putting a few more inches between himself and Vanessa. "You have no proof," she said quietly. "I have enough to reopen the investigation," I countered. "Just as I have enough evidence of Blake's financial manipulations to ensure Corwin Capital cuts all ties with him, permanently." Blake leaned forward. "My father made your father an offer 40 years ago," he said, his voice rough with anger. "Theodore took it. The sins of the father." are irrelevant to the choices of the son, I interrupted. You chose to target me, my marriage, and my career to settle a decades-old score. And you, I turned to my parents, chose to betray your own son rather than face your past mistakes honestly. My father looked down at his hands. My mother's chin lifted defiantly. So what now? Blake asked. You've frozen our assets, damaged our reputations, gathered us here for this dramatic presentation. What's your endgame, Voss? I touched the control panel again, bringing up architectural renderings of a stunning mountain property. This is Black Pine Lodge, I explained as the 3D model rotated to show the property from all angles. A remote, luxury estate I've acquired in New Hampshire. It features separate living quarters, communal spaces, and cutting-edge security systems. Four faces stared at me in confusion. I'm offering you a choice, I continued. Option 1. I proceed with criminal charges, civil suits, and public exposure of everything I've uncovered. You fight me in court for years, spend millions on legal fees, and potentially face prison time. I paused, letting the weight of that future settle over them. Option 2. You participate in a 30-day residential restitution program at Black Pine Lodge, under the supervision of certified psychologists and legal mediators. A what? Vanessa's incredulous voice broke the silence. A structured environment where we address the damage you've caused and determine appropriate reparations, I explained. The program is entirely voluntary. You can leave at any time, though doing so would automatically trigger option 1. I pressed another button, and 4 tablets rose from compartments in the table. The contracts contain individualized terms. For you, Blake, immunity from criminal charges. For Vanessa, retention of certain assets acquired during our marriage. For my parents, resolution of the debt Blake has accumulated against you. This is insane, my mother scoffed. It's actually legally impeccable, I replied. My attorneys have ensured every aspect is above board. You have 24 hours to decide. Sign the standard settlement with its harsh terms, or accept the program. I stood up, straightening my jacket. And to demonstrate the seriousness of my intent, I touched the screen one final time, bringing up a photo of my Shelby GT500, now partially restored. I've already recovered what was taken from me. The question is whether you want to recover what you're about to lose. I walked to the elevator, leaving them with the evidence of their betrayal and a choice that was no choice at all. 24 hours, I reminded them as the doors closed. Choose wisely. Black Pine Lodge materialized from the morning mist like something from a dream, or perhaps a particularly elegant nightmare. The main building was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all clean lines and vast windows, somehow both imposing and perfectly integrated with the surrounding forest. 2 smaller structures flanked it, connected by covered walkways that curved organically through the pine trees. I stood on the front steps with Leo and Dr. Meyer, watching as the first car wound its way up the long driveway. We'd prepared for this moment for weeks, but I still felt a flutter of nervous energy in my chest. Remember, Dr. Meyer said quietly, this is not about punishment. It's about accountability and healing. Leo checked his watch. Right on schedule. Blake Reynolds arrived first as I'd predicted. A sleek black Audi pulled up, and he emerged with a thin man carrying a leather briefcase. His personal attorney, no doubt. Blake's eyes widened slightly as he took in the property, professional assessment momentarily overtaking his wariness. Welcome to Black Pine Lodge, Mr. Reynolds, I said, stepping forward to greet him. Your attorney is welcome to review the facilities and legal documentation, but only you will be staying. The lawyer spent 2 hours examining every clause, every room, every security measure. He spoke privately with Blake several times, their heads bent close together in intense conversation. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he endorsed the documents. This is unconventional, the lawyer said to me as he prepared to leave, but technically above board. Mr. Reynolds understands the terms. Blake signed the papers without looking at me, his signature sharp and angry against the page. My father arrived next, driving the old Volvo he'd had since I was a teenager. He carried a single duffel bag and looked almost relieved, as though the weight of dreading this moment had been worse than its arrival. I've already started therapy, he said quietly as he signed his forms. Twice a week since I left the house. I'm ready to do the work, Dominic. My mother's arrival was markedly different. A hired car, 3 matching suitcases, and an expression of shock when she realized others were already there. You didn't say this would be communal, she said, her voice tight with disapproval. I thought we would have a private conversation, come to an understanding. The paperwork was explicit, Mother, I replied. Every aspect of the program was outlined in detail. She signed the documents with a flourish, as though the force of her signature could somehow alter the terms. Vanessa was the last to arrive, stepping from her BMW with calculated poise. She'd styled herself carefully, casual yet expensive clothing, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. It was the look of someone who had studied what reformed should look like. "I'll make the most of this opportunity," she said as she signed, her voice cool and measured. "I've already spoken with my publicist about how this experience will reshape my perspective." Leo caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. He'd predicted she would try to spin the situation to her advantage. After everyone had settled into their separate quarters, I gathered them in the main hall, a soaring space with a wall of windows framing the mountains beyond. The seating was arranged in a circle, with no position of power or prominence. "This program has 3 components," I explained, standing just outside the circle. "Individual therapy sessions with Dr. Meyer and her colleagues, group sessions where we address shared issues, and practical projects designed to build cooperation and accountability." Dr. Meyer stepped forward. "Before we begin, I'll be conducting baseline psychological assessments with each of you. These are confidential but will help us tailor the program to address specific patterns and needs." Those initial assessments revealed exactly what we had anticipated. My father was consumed by shame over his past choices, projecting his own fears onto me rather than facing them himself. My mother displayed classic narcissistic traits, using her son as an extension of herself, a vehicle for status enhancement. Vanessa's evaluation was particularly troubling, showing sociopathic tendencies and a clear pattern of using people until they were no longer valuable to her. Blake's psychology was more complex. Genuine guilt over his father's actions mixed with a desperate need to prove his own superiority. That first night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Leo's security system alerted us to unusual activity. Cameras showed Vanessa attempting to use an unauthorized electronic device she'd somehow smuggled in, trying to contact someone outside the lodge. "Should we confront her?" Leo asked, showing me the footage. "Not yet," I replied. "Let's see what she does next." At the end of that first difficult week, as we gathered for the final group session, I looked around at these 4 people who had betrayed me in different ways for different reasons. They sat stiffly in their chairs, still maintaining careful distances from each other, still clinging to their justifications and defenses. "We've spent this week examining the past," I said, standing to address them. "The old grievances, the cascading consequences of choices made decades ago. Starting tomorrow, we work with the present. The real work begins now." Dr. Meyer nodded approvingly, but I caught the flash of calculation in Vanessa's eyes. She was already planning her next move, already looking for the angle that would benefit her alone. She would learn, as they all would, that I had anticipated every possible response. There would be no escape from the truth at Black Pine Lodge, only through it. The second week at Black Pine Lodge began with a significant shift in the program's intensity. I had designed this progression carefully with Dr. Meyer: start with reflection, then gradually increase the emotional and physical demands. Push them toward breakthrough without breaking them entirely. "Today we begin the practical component," I announced at breakfast, noting how they all sat at separate tables despite the communal dining area. "Theodore and Blake, you'll be working on restoring an old tractor we found in the maintenance shed. Patricia, you'll be helping replant the eastern garden. Vanessa, you'll assist with cataloging the library." My mother's face tightened with indignation. "I'm not a gardener, Dominic. I have arthritis in my fingers." "The tasks are specifically chosen for their symbolic value," Dr. Meyer explained gently. "Working with growing things can be incredibly healing, Patricia." Despite her initial resistance to what she called degrading manual labor, my mother slowly found a quiet satisfaction in the garden work. By the 3rd day, she arrived early to check on the previous day's plantings, her designer clothes replaced by practical jeans and flannel shirts she'd previously considered beneath her dignity. My father and Blake made halting progress on the tractor, both the mechanical restoration and their ability to work together. Their shared project created a strange parallel to the relationship between their families, forcing them to rebuild something that had been broken through betrayal and neglect. "Your father wasn't always the cautious man you knew," Blake commented during one of our group sessions. "Theodore Voss used to be known for taking creative risks that revolutionized sustainable design before that was even a common term." My father looked startled at this unexpected acknowledgement. "Charles Reynolds was brilliant too before greed consumed him. He could visualize structural solutions that seemed impossible until he made them work." Vanessa performed her assigned tasks with effortless competence, but Dr. Meyer noted her emotional detachment. She's going through the motions, the doctor told me privately. Doing everything required but not actually engaging with the process. The fourth group session erupted into chaos when Blake suddenly turned on Vanessa. You manipulate everyone around you, he accused, his carefully maintained composure cracking. You played Dominic, you played his parents, and yes, you played me too. I know about the calls you made to Thomas Bennett's family after our last meeting at the hotel. Vanessa's calm facade slipped momentarily. You're delusional. You knew about the history between our families before you ever met Dominic, didn't you? Blake pressed, ignoring her dismissal. This wasn't opportunistic. This was calculated from the beginning. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Vanessa. For a moment, I thought she would continue to deny it, but something shifted in her expression. Fine, she said finally, her voice sharp and cold. Yes, I knew who Dominic was when I approached him at that charity gala 5 years ago. I'd done my research. The son of Theodore Voss, the architect who'd been ruined by Charles Reynolds. It seemed poetic. My father stood abruptly, his face ashen. You targeted my son because of me? Because of something that happened before he was born? You don't get to play the shocked victim, Theodore, Vanessa replied. You chose Blake's family over your own decades ago. I just helped complete the circle. My father turned to me, his eyes filled with grief. I kept the truth from you because I was afraid, he admitted, his voice breaking. Afraid you'd make the same mistake I did, dedicating your life to revenge instead of creation. I saw how talented you were, how much potential you had. I couldn't bear to watch you wasted on a vendetta the way I wasted years of my life. That night, Leo caught Vanessa attempting to bribe one of the kitchen staff to deliver a message to the outside. $5,000 to drop an envelope in town, Leo reported, showing me the sealed message addressed to her attorney. She's getting desperate. The next morning, while we were gathered for breakfast, my mother clutched suddenly at her chest, her face contorting in pain. I can't breathe, she gasped, collapsing against the table. Heart attack, Dr. Meyer said sharply, already moving to Patricia's side. Call the emergency helicopter. Now. I rode with my mother in the helicopter to the nearest hospital, holding her hand as the paramedics worked around us. Despite everything, the sight of her pale, frightened face triggered a rush of complex emotions, anger and betrayal inextricably tangled with an instinctive need to protect her. The cardiac episode had been triggered by an intense therapy session the previous day, where Patricia had finally begun to confront traumatic events from her own childhood, events that had shaped her need for control and status. During the 2 days I spent at the hospital with my mother, Vanessa made her move. With my attention diverted, she approached Blake, proposing they form an alliance to escape the program. We can still salvage this, Leo recorded her saying. Together we're stronger than him. But Blake, to my surprise, refused her offer. I'm seeing this through, he told her. For my father and for myself. Frustrated, Vanessa triggered the fire alarm that night, attempting to use the confusion to escape. Leo had anticipated this possibility, however, and security intercepted her before she could reach the perimeter road. When I returned with my mother 2 days later, I found Patricia changed by her near-death experience. For the first time, her remorse seemed genuine rather than performative. I never gave you the space to be yourself, she whispered as I helped her to her room. I was so afraid of losing control, of going back to being poor and powerless. I'm sorry, Dominic. I'm so sorry. The walls were beginning to crumble just as I had designed them to. The third week at Black Pine Lodge began with the arrival of Dr. Meyer's full team of therapeutic specialists. The casual observer might have mistaken the sudden influx of professionals for a medical emergency, but I knew better. This was the week we'd planned for breakthroughs, the carefully calculated moment when defenses would be at their weakest and truth might finally emerge. My mother, still physically fragile from her heart attack, was the first to crack open emotionally. During a one-on-one session with Dr. Meyer that I observed through the monitoring system, Patricia finally revealed the root of her controlling behavior. My father left when I was 8, she said, fingers nervously pleating the edge of her sweater. No warning, no goodbye. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, but we lost everything. The house, our standing in the community, my friends whose parents suddenly decided I wasn't good enough anymore. She looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. I swore my child would never experience that insecurity, that social exile. I thought I was protecting Dominic, but I was just controlling him, using him to fix my own broken past. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising. but hearing her articulate it with such raw honesty sent an unexpected pang through my chest. In the workshop, my father and Blake had progressed to examining the deeper patterns that had shaped their family's conflict. Our fathers were both proud men, Theodore said as they worked together to rebuild the tractor's engine. Too proud to back down, too stubborn to compromise. And we inherited that stubborn pride, Blake acknowledged, handing my father a wrench. I spent my entire career trying to prove myself to a father who could never see past his own grievances. The greatest tragedy, my father replied, is that Charles and I could have built something remarkable together, if we'd managed to trust each other. Blake looked at the half-restored tractor between them. Maybe it's not too late for that legacy, just through different hands. Vanessa became increasingly isolated as the others began showing genuine remorse. While my parents and Blake engaged meaningfully with the process, she maintained her performance of cooperation without the emotional investment. On Wednesday, her lawyer unexpectedly appeared at the lodge, brandishing a court order permitting him to check on his client's welfare. I later learned she had managed to get a message out through one of the food delivery services, claiming she was being held against her will. "I'll be recording everything," the lawyer announced as Leo escorted him through the facility. "Any sign of coercion or improper detention will result in immediate legal action." By the end of his inspection, which included a private meeting with Vanessa, tours of the accommodations and reviews of the daily schedule, the lawyer's aggressive stance had noticeably softened. "This is not what I expected," he admitted to me as he prepared to leave. "The program appears legitimate and well-designed. I've advised Ms. Voss that continuing would likely benefit her legal position in the long run." That evening, Vanessa orchestrated her most dramatic performance yet. During dinner, she rushed from the table and locked herself in her bathroom, shouting that she couldn't take it anymore, that she was going to end it all. Dr. Meyer calmly organized a crisis response, but the security cameras had already captured Vanessa's preparations, hiding her actual medication while setting out empty pill bottles, carefully musing her hair, and practicing distressed expressions in the mirror before emerging to create the scene. During the resulting intervention, Vanessa's frustration at being outmaneuvered led to her most honest moment yet. "You think you're so clever," she spat at me as Dr. Meyer and her team maintained a professional demeanor. "You and your perfect little redemption camp." Thomas thought he was clever too, checking the car for tampering, installing carbon monoxide detectors I had to disable twice. The room fell silent at this inadvertent confession. Even Blake, who had suspected the truth about her first husband's death, looked shaken by the casual revelation. As the program entered its final week, Dr. Meyer introduced what she called redemption projects. Plans each participant would develop for how they would use their experience to create positive change going forward. My father presented his proposal first, a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs, designed to help them recognize and avoid predatory business practices. "I can't undo the past," he said, his voice steady with new resolve, "but I can help others avoid my mistakes." Blake followed with plans for an ethical investment fund specializing in sustainable development projects. "Using capital to build rather than destroy, that's how I want to redefine the Reynolds legacy." My mother, still moving carefully after her heart incident, outlined a support group for mothers struggling with over-controlling tendencies. "I want to help other women see their children as individuals, not extensions of themselves or solutions to their own pain." Vanessa refused to participate, sitting silently with arms crossed during her allotted presentation time. What she didn't know was that Leo had already forwarded evidence of her confessions about her first husband to the proper authorities. On the final evening, as we gathered in the main hall one last time, I addressed the group with a sense of completion I hadn't anticipated feeling. "Tomorrow you return to the world," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "The true test of restitution begins there, in your daily choices, in how you rebuild what was broken." This program was never the end, it was always just the beginning. 5 years passed like the turning of blueprint pages, each one a careful design, executed with precision, building toward something greater than its individual elements. The grand opening of the new Voss Sustainable Architecture headquarters drew media attention from around the world. Not just because the 60-story tower was a marvel of ecological engineering, generating more energy than it consumed, harvesting rainwater, supporting vertical gardens that improved air quality for blocks around, but because of the story behind it. My story. Our story. In the gleaming lobby, displayed in a custom glass case like a museum piece, sat my fully restored 1967 Shelby GT500. The car that had been stolen, damaged, and sold off in an act of betrayal had been reborn. Every bolt, every panel, every circuit restored to perfection. Beside it, a simple plaque read, "Sometimes what is broken can be rebuilt stronger than before." My father arrived early, looking healthier than I'd seen him in decades. At 72, Theodore Voss had found a new purpose running his foundation for young entrepreneurs. The program had already prevented dozens of fraudulent takeovers and predatory contracts. "Dominic," he called, waving from across the lobby. Beside him stood a young woman I'd first met 2 years ago, my half-sister Jessica, born from a relationship my father had hidden for decades. Another secret unveiled during our time at Black Pine Lodge. "The place is magnificent," Jessica said, hugging me warmly. Her architectural studies at MIT had given us common ground, a relationship built on shared passion rather than complicated history. My mother arrived separately, having reconciled with the family but chosen to maintain her independence. The support groups she led for mothers struggling with control issues had become unexpectedly successful, her own painful growth giving her insights therapy alone could never have provided. "The vertical gardens are inspired," she noted, examining the living walls with genuine interest. "You've always had an eye for integrating nature with structure." The comment, a simple observation rather than an attempt to take credit or control, marked how far she had come. Blake Reynolds arrived with Meredith, formerly Vanessa's closest friend, who had ultimately helped expose her manipulations. Their relationship had been unexpected, developing naturally after Meredith approached Blake to apologize for her unwitting role in Vanessa's schemes. "The ethical investment fund is oversubscribed," Blake told me, his handshake firm and direct. "We're focusing on sustainable architecture projects now. Your Berlin designs created a template others are desperate to follow." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The son of Charles Reynolds now financing the vision of Theodore Voss's son, closing a circle that had begun in bitterness 2 generations ago. A journalist approached as we stood together near the Shelby. "Mr. Voss, would you care to comment on Vanessa Voss's situation? There are rumors she might be granted early release." "The past belongs in the past," I replied, the practiced answer I'd given dozens of times before. "Today is about looking forward." On a massive screen behind the reporter, a news ticker scrolled silently, "Vanessa Voss sentenced to 15 years for fraud and conspiracy in the death of first husband Thomas Bennett." After the ceremony and speeches, I slipped away to meet Elizabeth Meyer in the private garden on the building's 40th floor. In the 3 years since we'd become a couple, she had transformed from my Berlin therapist to my partner in every sense of the word. "The rehabilitation center at the renovated Black Pine Lodge is at capacity," she told me, accepting the glass of champagne I offered. "Your funding has allowed us to expand the program to help dozens of families dealing with betrayal trauma." "And the new project?" I asked, unrolling architectural plans on the garden table. "A network of ecological recovery centers for victims of psychological abuse," she confirmed, tracing the sustainable features I'd integrated into the designs. "Healing environments for healing people." As the sun set behind us, painting the Boston skyline in amber and gold, I felt the weight of the past finally lift. The architecture of revenge had served its purpose, creating space for something far more valuable to be built in its place. Later that evening, Elizabeth and I drove the Shelby to a charity gala for the rehabilitation foundation we'd established together. In the back seat lay the architectural model for my next major project, a transformative urban renewal development that would provide sustainable housing for families recovering from financial trauma. "You know," I said as we cruised along the coast, the Shelby's engine purring with restored power, "buildings like people can have second lives. Sometimes they need to be stripped down to their foundations before they can be rebuilt properly." Elizabeth smiled, her hand finding mine on the gearshift. "And what are you now, Dominic?" "Still the architect of revenge." I watched the road ahead, thinking of all the twisted paths that had led to this moment, the betrayals, the discoveries, the painful reckonings that had ultimately created possibility where before there had been only bitterness. "No," I said finally, feeling the truth of it resonate through me. "I'm an architect of rebirth. That was always my true strength."